everyone. Thanks for coming this morning. So now for something completely different, I think. So for the next 50 minutes, we're going to southern Arizona, the Sonoran Desert. And if you're lucky enough to be there in the springtime, you might see a scene looking something like this. What you can't see in this picture is all the insects foraging from these flowers. And if you came back to that scene even a few days or maybe even a few hours later, if you're an insect, you might see this. Well, you might see the same insects there, but the foraging environment is most likely going to be different. So places that were previously rich in nectar might be now depleted, and new rich nectar sources might have come up that weren't there before. So what I'm going to be asking in this talk is how flexible individuals should be in their behavioral strategies, in this case foraging specifically, in the face of environmental variation, and in this case variation in a foraging environment. And so the model system that I'm using to answer this question is honeybee foraging, particularly of manzanita flowers, which you can see up here, in the Santa Catalina Mountains, just outside Tucson in southern Arizona. And we know a lot about the natural history of insects foraging from these flowers from previous work in Judith Bronstein's lab. What's interesting about this system is that the manzanita plants bloom really early. You can see some artfully placed snow on these flowers up here. They flower much earlier than anything else. This is really the only nectar source that's available in the early spring. Honeybees are some of the most abundant insects foraging from these flowers. So in contrast to lots of other studies that have looked at foraging decisions and what types of flowers, what species of flowers to forage from, in this case there's really only one type of flowers available. But honeybees have different options, namely what kind of foraging strategy to adopt. So let me take you through the options available to honeybees. So first of all, the most common foraging strategy, what we usually see insects doing, is called legitimate visitation. So this is obtaining nectar through the opening of the flower, which is likely to result in pollination. But if you look at these manzanita flowers here, you can see these holes at the base of the flower. And those holes were cut by another insect, probably an andrenan bee in this system. And that's called primary nectar robbing. So that's a way of obtaining nectar bypassing this legitimate route that's likely to result in pollination. So you can think of that as essentially cheating in a pollination mutualism, so taking nectar without resulting in pollination. And honeybees actually don't have the mouthparts to primary rob flowers themselves, but they can do what's called secondary robbing, where they can use holes that are cut by primary robbers to access nectar directly, again without unlikely to pollinate the flowers. Okay. So honeybees have these two options for obtaining nectar from manzanita flowers. And so what kind of environmental variation do they face? Well, there are a couple of things. First of all, the abundance of flowers that have those primary robbing holes varies. So I have on the x-axis here the proportion of flowers with holes ranging from around 10% down here to around 90% up here. You can see most plants have a kind of 50 to 60% proportion of flowers with holes. We do see a very wide range. Secondly, the amount of nectar that's available to be collected from these flowers varies. So on the right, flowers with holes, you can see with this box here, have a significantly less nectar than intact flowers on the left. Okay? So we've got variation in the frequency of flowers with holes and variation in the amount of nectar that's available to be collected. So to return to the main question that I'm asking, is how flexible individuals should be in the face of this kind of variation. And we can think of this as a continuum where at one end you'll see a low degree of adjustment of a behavior to the environment. So we can think of that as fixed behavior. So the potential advantage of that is that you don't have a cost of switching behavioral strategies whenever the environment changes. And at the other end of this continuum, we have flexible behaviors where you see a high degree of adjustment to environmental variation. And the advantage there is that you can closely match your behavior to take advantage of changes in the environment, but you may have some kind of cost of switching behaviors. Okay. So where do honeybee foraging fall on this continuum? Okay, so there are two decisions faced by foraging honeybees in this system. First of all, which foraging strategy to use. So are they going to visit flowers legitimately or secondarily rob them? And secondly, if bees adopt this legitimate strategy, they have two flower choices open to them. First of all, they can feed from intact flowers, or they can choose flowers with holes. And remember, I just showed you that the amount of nectar in intact flowers is higher than that in flowers with holes. So to answer these questions, we went to our field site with manzanita bushes, which you can see in the background here with some undergraduate field assistants, to observe honeybee foraging bouts. So a bout is a foraging trip at a given plant, where a bee will make a series of visits to individual flowers. So we followed honeybee bouts, and for each visit we recorded what foraging strategy it was using, whether it's legitimate visitation or secondary robbing. Also the number of holes on that flower for each visit. And we also, for each individual plant that we were observing, counted the frequency of holes from 10 inflorescences or bunches of flowers on that plant. Okay, so let me take you back to this decision tree. So remember, we had two steps. First, deciding which strategy to use, and second, for legitimate visitors, deciding which flower type to visit. So to answer the first question, which strategy do bees adopt, and does that change in the face of environmental variation? So if you're a secondary robber, remember you can only feed from flowers that have holes already cut by primary robbers. So the first question to ask is whether the frequency of secondary robbing changes in response to the frequency or availability of flowers with holes. And then we predict that secondary robbing would increase when there are more flowers with holes available. And up to a certain point, that's what we see, but it doesn't seem to be quite that straightforward. So on the x-axis, again, I have the proportion of flowers on a plant that have holes. On the y-axis, I've got the proportion of visits within a foraging bout that are secondary robbing rather than legitimate visitation. The dotted line here is a one-to-one relationship. Okay? And so what we actually see is that the highest proportion of secondary robbing visits within a bout is in intermediate proportion of flowers with holes. So up to a certain point, bees are secondary robbing more when there are more flowers with holes, but that drops off when there's a higher proportion of flowers with holes, which suggests that the relative advantage of secondary robbing when there are lots of flowers with holes is less than legitimate visitation. And for this system, we actually haven't been able to measure how much nectar the bees are getting out of manzanita flowers. The flowers are only about half a centimetre big, and to get nectar out, you have to destroy the flowers. So that's something to think about in the future, how effective secondary robbing is as a strategy relative to the legitimate visitation at different proportions of flowers with holes. So to recap this question, we predicted an increase in secondary robbing with an increase in the frequency of flowers with holes, and we in fact didn't see a direct increase. We saw this peak at an intermediate frequency of flowers with holes. So to move on to the second part of this decision tree, I'm considering legitimate visitation only, and whether bees are visiting intact flowers or flowers with holes. So given what I told you earlier about the amounts of nectar available in intact flowers versus flowers with holes, we can ask whether legitimate visitors prefer to visit intact flowers versus flowers with holes because they contain more nectar. And so we predict that the frequency of legitimate visits to flowers with holes is lower than the frequency of flowers with holes that you find on a plant. Okay? And that is in fact what we find. So on the left-hand side of this box plot here, you can see that there are about a third of flowers on this plant have holes, but only about a tenth of legitimate visits that bees are making are to flowers with holes. So it looks like they're disproportionately visiting intact flowers. So just to summarize, we predicted the frequency of legitimate visits to flowers with holes would be lower than the frequency of flowers with holes in the plant, and that is indeed what we found. But what happens as the frequency of flowers with holes changes? Remember, I showed you at the very beginning a variation in the proportion of flowers with holes across different plants. So does that frequency of legitimate visits to flowers with holes change when the proportion of flowers with holes changes? And you might predict that it does, that it's more costly to avoid flowers with holes when there are more of them in the environment. So you might see more legitimate visits to flowers with holes when there are more flowers with holes available. And that is, in fact, what we see. So again, proportion of flowers with holes on the x-axis, proportion of legitimate visits to flowers with holes on the y-axis, and again, this dotted line shows a one-to-one relationship. And we see an increase in the number of the proportion of legitimate visits to flowers with holes as the proportion of flowers with holes increases, likely because it becomes more costly to avoid them. Okay, so just to sum up, again we predicted increased frequency of legitimate visits to flowers with holes, and that is indeed what we see when the frequency of flowers with holes increases. So just to return to the general question that I was asking at the beginning, how flexible should individuals be in the face of environmental variation? I showed you this continuum from fixed behaviors with low degree of adjustment. So the benefit is that you don't have to track environmental variation and switch behaviors, versus flexible behaviors where you can benefit by closely matching your behavior to what's most appropriate in the environment. I looked at this in this honeybee foraging system where we first asked which strategy is optimal for honeybees to use. We found that they do adjust their frequency of secondary robbing depending on the availability of flowers with holes. I secondly asked whether legitimate visitors visit flowers with holes in proportion to their frequency in the environment. We found that they didn't, but they in fact adjusted their behavior as the frequency of flowers with holes changed. So if we return to our continuum, I hope I've shown you that honeybees are showing behavioral flexibility in this environment, and likely they do benefit by adjusting their behavior to changes in the availability of nectar in their foraging environment. And so lastly, I'd just like you to take away the message that this isn't just a question of honeybee foraging. These kind of decisions are faced by foraging animals, other insects and mammals and birds as well, and they're in foraging environments. And also the question of how closely individuals should match their behavior to the environment isn't only relevant to foraging decisions. This picture here, maybe this man should think about what kind of environment he's in while he's checking his phone while crossing a busy New York street. So with that, I'd like to thank the Bronstein Lab at the University of Arizona